Peace be still, peace be still, the storm rages. Peace be still, peace be still, peace be still, the storm rages. Peace be still, peace be still, peace be still, the storm rages. Peace be still.
Jesus in the middle of the storm. Jesus in the middle of the storm is a story that we hear 6 times across the Gospels. Now, maybe in origin, this story was the record of 2 different encounters with Jesus. One encounter in which the storm is raging and Jesus is asleep in the stern of the boat. We hear that story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then a second encounter in which the storm is raging and Jesus walks on the surface of the lake. We hear that story in Matthew, Mark, and John. Or maybe in origin, this was a single encounter. And over the years, as memory shifted, as the story shifted, the way that stories do around the campfire, it became 2 separate tales. Regardless, Jesus in the Storm is a story that we hear 6 times. It has that in common with the story that we heard last week, the one in which Jesus feeds all of these people, the one that is sometimes called the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. And this repetition suggests that these stories are something that Jesus' first followers, that the young church understood as vital to understanding the gospel, to understanding who Jesus is and what following him means. In Jesus' life, there is this malleable and permeable border between the real and the metaphorical. Jesus is constantly doing things and saying things, and things are happening to him which are both very concrete and also function as symbols. And we saw that in the story that we heard last week, in the story of the loaves and the fishes. Before we get to anything heady or spiritual, this story has a very earthy, justice-oriented meaning, which is that Jesus sees hungry people and he feeds them. And as Jesus' followers, we are called to do the same. When people are hungry, we are called to feed them. And there are these layers and layers of symbol within the story. This is like, maybe you remember one of those encyclopedias where there's a side view of an archaeological dig and all of these layers of history, pots and fossils and jewelry and who knows what down beneath the earth. The story is the same. In the story of the loaves and the fishes, we find that to encounter Jesus is to discover abundance. It is to discover the shattering of rules that we thought were absolute. It is to discover the crossing of boundaries. It is to discover fecundity and holy possibility. It is to discover joyous surprise. The list goes on. And this week is the same. At the most basic level, we are in a storm, and a bad one at that. The waves are pitching high and low. The wind is blowing hard. The boat is rocking violently. There is spray coming up into our faces. Perhaps there is thunder and lightning. And the fishers on the boat So most of Jesus's first followers, maybe all of them, are fishers. They have hundreds of hours out on the water, maybe thousands of hours out on the water, and they are afraid. That tells you that this is a bad storm. This is a bit like when you're on an airplane and the turbulence kicks in. And when that happens, I always look at the flight attendants. If the flight attendants are calm, then I know that this is really not a big deal. This is an unpleasant experience rather than a dangerous one. If the flight attendants look afraid, and thankfully I've never been on a flight where that happens, but if the flight attendants were to look afraid, I would know that it would be time to start putting my will into order. And this is the same. We have these inveterate fishers, and they are full of fear at this storm. Herbert Driscoll, the wonderful Scottish-Canadian preacher, has joked that you can tell that Jesus is the only one who's not a fisher among his friends, whether he's sleeping in the stern or calmly walking on the water, because he doesn't know enough to be afraid of the storm. So the storm rages violently, and we on the boat, on its deck as it pitches back and forth, wonder if we are about to drown. This is a moment when you or I might call out to God. We might say, God, help me, please. And what happens then? What happens when we call out to God in our fear? Well, God shows up. God comes walking across the water towards us. God is not watching the scene from a distant mountaintop or a cloud or a castle. God is right here. Here's the promise, the name that we heard at the beginning of the Gospels, Emmanuel. God is with us. This is good news, and it's hard news. It's good news because we discover that as the storm rages, God is not somewhere else. Alleluia. And it's hard news because the storm rages and God is there, and God isn't stopping the storm. God is present, and the storm rages anyway. The literal storm rages, and here again is this permeable and malleable border between the literal and the metaphorical, the real and the symbolic. This literal storm rages, and the storm, which is an archetype, rages as well. The storm is an ancient symbol for chaos, for the absence of control, for danger, for fear, for the possibility of death, for just our worlds being shaken and stability being gone. Maybe we know something. Maybe you know something about what it feels like to live in a storm like that. If the Gospels were a novel, and the Gospels are not a novel, there are 1,001 ways in which the Gospels refuse to be categorized as though they were a modern book. But if they were a novel, then Peter would be something like the sidekick. That's a classic role within literature. As a young person, I loved Agatha Christie's mystery stories, and I loved in particular the stories of her Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. And the Poirot mystery stories work. They function in large part because of Poirot's sidekick, Hastings. Hastings' job is to say the things that you or I would say, to think the things that you or I would think, to do the things that you or I would do. Poirot's friend and sometimes biographer and companion stands in for us in the story. And Peter does precisely the same thing as Hastings. After the transfiguration, after this awe-filled and joy-filled encounter, this encounter of transformation, Peter is the one who says, let's build houses and stay here forever. Not very long after that, when Jesus starts talking about how he's going to get murdered by the state and by the religious authorities, Peter is the one who does what you or I would do. He takes Jesus aside and says, Jesus, you have to stop talking like that. At the end of Jesus' life, Peter is the one who promises that he will never leave Jesus. And then when he is confronted with the brutal violence of the state, he runs in fear. That's something I might do, and maybe you would do, even though we don't want to. And in this moment as well, Peter does what you or I might do. He is on this pitching boat in the middle of this violent sea, and he looks out and he sees Jesus walking towards him, walking towards us. The waves go up and they swell down again, and Jesus never breaks stride, now going into the air, now going down into a valley of water. He just keeps on walking, never losing his balance, always going forward. And Peter has one of those bracelets on that says WWJD. What would Jesus do? This is the question of his life, and he has the answer in front of him. In the middle of a storm like this, Jesus would walk on water. And so Peter kicks his leg over the side of the boat and then kicks the other over the side of the boat, puts his weight down on the water and starts walking. And for a few steps, it works. For a few steps, he is doing it. His balance taking him back and forth with the swell of the waves. But then he starts to notice the danger, the impossibility, the absurdity of what he is doing. I don't know if any of you had the experience when you were first learning to ride a bike of the adult or the older child who was helping you, a dad or a mom or an uncle or a sibling, giving you a push and letting you go. And for a few marvelous seconds, you are pedaling along by yourself. I'm doing it. I'm riding a bike. But then you start to think. You start to think about the impossibility of two wheels staying up. You start to think about how much it would hurt if you were to land on the cement or the gravel or the asphalt. And that thinking does you in, and suddenly you are down, banging your knee hard. Something like that happens to Peter. He takes the step, and he says, oh no. And instantly when he says that, oh no, it's like his foot goes through ice on the surface of a lake, and he's down up to his thigh and soaked, and the rest of him is sinking. Help me, Lord. He says, help me, I'm going to drown. And right away, Jesus reaches down and grabs him by the arm. Oh, Peter, he says, and I imagine Jesus smiling in a big way in this moment. Peter, you almost were doing it. You almost did it, you of little faith. And then he pulls Peter back up, and the two of them go back to the boat. I don't know if Peter walks a little bit on the water as they go back to the boat, or if Peter's kind of half swimming, or if Jesus is carrying him. I'm not sure. They step over and into the boat, and the storm is done. The storm is done the instant that Jesus steps into the boat. And everyone on the boat, you and me and all of the other fishers who were so afraid, with good reason, of this storm, we fall down on our faces and we worship Jesus. What does the end of this story mean? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it means, but I know that it's true. I know that it is right. That in the middle of the storm, in the middle of this literal and metaphorical chaos, I know that Jesus is there, and I know that that brings us peace. Peace be still. I think this peace is what Richard Rohr is talking about when he says that people who are in deep communion with God, deep conversation with God, achieve this fundamental okayness with life. They achieve this okayness with the storm. It's not that the storm doesn't happen to them, not that loss doesn't happen to them, that grief doesn't happen to them. It totally does. They totally know about loss and grief and unfairness and injustice and all of these things, about suffering. And they have this okayness anyway. The story that we hear 6 times, Jesus in the storm, the story in which the real and the metaphorical intersect, it tells us that in the storm, Jesus isn't somewhere else. And maybe if we find that okayness for ourselves, it'll be because we know that even as the storm rages, Jesus is with us, and Jesus always, always will bring us home.